Okay, Sal. So moving on with our hip hinge series. What do you do if someone can't even do an unloaded hip hinge without lower back pain? So
Fire them.
That's it. Fire them as a client and let
Not
them
worth
just
it.
live in decrepit pain for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
No, that's not what we do here. So there is an old school exercise called a Polish good morning. I don't know why it's called a Polish good morning. I don't know the history behind it. You can't. I don't even think you can find it online, other than I think an article I wrote on it. But
Redacted, I think.
it's redacted, yes, because you can't call anything Polish or Romanian or American anymore. But anyway, so what we find is that for a lot of people that can't hip hinge without pain, they have back instability because their hips aren't in the right position and nothing functions around the hip. So what we think is if I can't move my torso forward without pain, then maybe I should think about working it under the hip instead. So what we'll do initially is we'll work on a Polish good morning. So we'll put the leg into its lengthened state and we'll first strengthen it isometrically. Once it's done isometrically, then we'll utilize a cable to then load the movement. And then in a lot of cases, 6 to 8 weeks of that and all the back pain is gone. And then we can move them on to seated good morning, standing good morning, RDLs and all that. So for a Polish good morning, Shane's going to put one of his legs, his feet, on the plyo box here. And we're gonna keep the knee completely straight. And what I want you to do is bend the right knee slightly. And now we're gonna drive the foot into the box. So what I'm going to do, you're going to notice he's going to create tension on the back of the leg, but without rotating anything or flexing or extending anything. Do you feel tension there? And so what we might do, if we think about time under tension, I might do 10 reps of this with like a 5-second push and then release. 5-second push and release. So what we're doing is we're using isometrics to make the muscle stronger in a lengthened position without making the muscle change length or dynamics. Okay. And then the second thing we'll do is we'll have them, once they master this, so where do you feel this mainly?
Top part of my calf and slightly behind my knee.
Right behind your knee. So if we want to then push the focus up more, what I might do is I might tell the client to push the foot down and drive the hip backwards. Okay. So now, where do you feel that? Starting to climb up the leg. Starting to climb up the leg. So we push down and drag. So we're thinking about dragging the heel back. Okay. So we'll use our stick again. So pull back into my stick. Okay. There. And then we want to make sure this. Can we stay upright? Okay. Does that increase any of the demand? Yeah, a little bit. So this is kind of the level 1 thing. So we push the leg down and then we draw the hip back. That's usually really fatiguing for people, so we'll do multiple reps of 3 to 5 seconds and then start working up into longer time under tension, like even 30 to 60 seconds for 1 or 2 reps. The second thing we may do is do all the same thing, but then try to bend the knee in that position. So when we try to bend the knee, obviously, because it's straight leg, you're not gonna be able to bend it. So if you push the heel down, drag the leg back, and then try to bend the knee, and now you'll feel it really starting to climb into the hip. Okay, so what we're doing is we're trying to work hip extension without actually having to extend the hip. Okay, once we get that strengthened, in a lot of cases, people don't have a problem with hip hinging. But we really need to start loading this through dynamic motion as well, because doing the isometrics will get them 50% of the way there, but then we have to load that into a position where they can start rotating the hip as well. Traditionally, you would load this with a barbell. Okay, what I've found is that loading it with a cable makes a much better choice, because we can have a cable, much like with a cable split squat, we use that so they follow the cable. If I put a cable here and you're holding the cable out, then the cable will pull you forward here without you having to flex or extend anything. And that way we can keep this back stable and strong while allowing the cable to pull us into a deeper stretch or deeper isometric contraction, and then we can pull back and learn how to start extending the hip and rotating the hip in that manner. Does that make sense?
Something I've noticed with your feet. So why are you choosing a plantar flex position over a dorsiflex position?
Okay, so that's a good observation. Number 1, I didn't realize I was doing that, but I'm glad you picked up on that. Okay, so in a plantar flex position, you will have more slack on the sciatic nerve, so that will actually allow you to get more range of motion. If I then want to floss the nerve a bit and create more demand, I can pull their toes up into a dorsiflex position, which will cause the nerve root for the sciatic nerve to pull more, which will make the contraction come on deeper. So if we want to regress back, we might actually go into more of a plantar flexed and then move into a dorsiflex position. And you'll also notice, because you were doing it in a dorsiflex, yep. So if I go in a plantar flexed, now that I'm contracting the upper calf, it has less involvement, okay? Because it can't work on both the ankle and the knee at the same time. So you'll feel a lot more stretch or a lot more lengthening in the hamstring. If I pull that back, then it ties in the calf alongside the hamstring as well. So you'll get it all the way from the heel all the way into the hip. We can also change the direction of the foot as well, okay? So if we think about, you've got the long head and the short head of the leg biceps on one side, semimembranosus and tendinosus on the other. So if I want to work one side of the hamstring versus the other, I might rotate the leg out to hit the leg biceps, or I might rotate it in to hit the semimembranosus, semitendinosus. So it might actually be good to even work all three of those.
And one of the other things that I have is that, so similar to a split squat, you're up on a, let's say a 12-inch box at the moment. Would you work on first progressing them down towards the floor, or are you progressing them as early as you can into a bilateral hinge movement?
Yeah, so what I would do is I would actually start them with for a lot of people, a lower box and work them up to a higher box to increase the demand. And then what I'm thinking is, realistically, where's their torso angle going to be when they're at the bottom of their hinge? So if I were to put the box low, then we're saying they only need to go to here. So that's the only demand. If they're needing to go here, which they're going to need for deadlifting and for squatting, then yeah, we would start to bring the box up and we would look at that torso angle and say, okay, how high does the leg need to be for them to get in a perfect deadlift or a perfect squat appropriately? And then once we're here, and there's no back pain and they know how to engage the hip extensors, then we would work into a bilateral movement at that point.
And my last question here is that you mentioned, I think it was the start of the video, it might have been in a previous video, is about using isometrics over reps. Now, I know you're a fan of, especially for this, is that, for example, you mentioned at the start here, is that I'm just going to create tension by first driving the heel down and then holding that for isometric for periods of time rather than necessarily accumulating reps, right? Now, is that something that, especially because of in these earlier phases, through the GPP phases for a lot of our general population clients, you'd rather focus on time under tension to teach them how to hold that movement and to teach them, you talked before about activating, shortening the myofibrils. So about shortening that, or at least getting them to be able to cross over and contract properly. Is that something that you're using the isometrics for, or would you rather start them with isometrics and work them into reps?
I would rather start them with the reps first because they tend to be very fatiguing, especially because that's a position that they don't often find themselves in. So what I found was if I give someone a set of 60 seconds, they can't do it. Right. So what we do is let's try 3 to 5 seconds to see if you can handle that, and then let's layer that into multiple reps, and then let's see if we can lock all those reps in together, so that way we can create anti-fatigue when they need to keep those stable positions when they're in dynamic movement. Okay. Cool. One of the biggest kind of eye-openers that I've seen is when we started doing things like structural backloading and thinking about link tension across joints. So if we have people that sit down a lot, inherently the front of the legs are going to get overly shortened and contracted, which is going to pull the hip forward and down, and which is going to create tightness in the hamstrings, but it's not really tightness, it's more what we call tautness, because the muscle's already in a chronically stretched state. We get a lot of people here at the OPC that will come in and do an hour of hamstring stretching, and when I first came in, I asked them, why are you doing so much hamstring stretching? Oh, because my hamstrings are too tight, so it's wrecking my lower back. When we started giving them more couch stretches to then release the tension on the front of the leg and started working a lot more of the lengthened isometrics and the lengthened ranges of motion strengthening for the muscles that were overly long, we were able to correct people's back issues within 3 to 4 weeks.
Right. So in terms of laying this up, or laying this out in terms of the program, so for the guys who are watching this and going, okay, I'm going to figure out how I fit this into my client's program at the moment, when we talk about putting this into a GPP, so these are the early stages of someone's programming, so this is why we're focusing on a lot more the detail is in the movement rather than necessarily just chasing reps and load. And this is a conversation for another video in terms of reps and what that's going to be indicative of in terms of regarding load. But when we're thinking about pairing this, so you just mentioned your client comes in, they've got issues with hamstrings, lower back pain. You're pairing a Polish good morning with what, like an antagonist stretch on the front, or you're pairing that with same side stretch on the back, like a hurdler stretch or something like that?
Yeah, so when we think about it, we don't need to really stretch the hamstrings. We need to put it in that length and straight and strengthen it more. So what we would do is we would pair it with an antagonistic stretch. So we might do a couch stretch into a isometric Polish good morning. And then we might, if we want to get even more advanced, we might even put them into some type of hip extended leg curl, like a Gironda leg curl or a TRX supine hip extension to leg curl or a Swiss ball shelf, in order to then train the hamstring in a fully contracted position too. What we've found is that if we can get the muscle stronger at the lengthened position, it starts to shorten the muscle, and then we can reinforce that, especially with the nervous system, by strengthening it in the fully contracted position. And we see a lot of people's hip issues, and their anterior pelvic rotation starts to correct really quickly into neutral hip. And then we can reinforce that with other things like split squats and step ups and good seated good mornings and things like that. Yeah. And I think we had a discussion earlier with some of our clients with a lot of lower back pain where their lower lumbar erectors are hypertonic all the time and they feel like bricks. If we think about, most people would want to try to stretch that. They say, oh, this is so tight, I need to stretch that. It's very difficult to stretch the lower back, and in a lot of cases, that's what's the only thing holding your lower back and your hip together. So it makes more sense if we strengthen the things that need to be strengthened, like the obliques. We were talking at lunch about the oblique sling, working on the obliques, working on the lats to keep the lats connected, the torso connected to the hips, working on stretching and strengthening the psoas, which tends to be very short and tight on people, but also very weak, and then stretching out what needs to be stretched, which is most often than not the rec fem.
And that's something, just touching on the psoas briefly, I think that's something that we see in a lot of people is that the psoas is a muscle that is very undertrained in a lot of people, coaches, general population, whoever it may be. But especially when we do any type of muscle testing, we notice, especially in that shortened range, which is going to be very indicative, or very indicative in the positions of when you're finding yourself in the bottom of the squat, and people are getting that hip pain and that pinching and things like that. And while yes, I understand is like that can be caused by other things, is that when they're in that position where now that psoas is fully shortened, it's completely weak. Absolutely. And we don't train that in terms of an isolated sense. We don't train that in actually thinking about hip flexion and then being able to hold that as well isometrically for a sustained period of time.
And then actually going into proper hip flexion without the right fem and the TFL being the main hip flexor, but also using the psoas. So that's a good discussion for another video, so we'll do that video next. But when growing up in the industry, I was taught never to train the hip flexors as far as the psoas, because it was assumed that everybody's psoas is really tight. Now, if you go back in the archives of the internet, Kelly Baggett, who is he's a specialist in speed and vertical jump development, was telling everybody 20 years ago that everyone was wrong about this, that if you don't have good strength in the psoas, it's going to limit your ability to extend, jump, and run correctly, and I'm finding that to be 100% true. So a lot of people will avoid training their psoas when they actually need to train their psoas. In a lot of cases, though, that hypertonic psoas, if we can strengthen it through a lengthened state and also get all the other muscles playing well around it and get the hip shifted back, a lot of times that tension goes away.
I think that's the same mindset as not needing to train the abs because you're trained in big compound movements. And it's like, yes, if you've already got the strength in place with those muscles, then you can start to combine them into whatever movements you're doing. But isolation before integration, right?
And I can tell you right now, dealing with the lumbar issues that I've dealt with this year, that has absolutely changed my perspective of used to being from the school that you could get all the core strengthening and stability you needed from heavy squats, overhead presses, deadlifts, and all that. It's absolutely incorrect. If you don't train those, they will get dysfunctional, and if they're not strong enough, you'll limit not only your strength, but also you'll increase your injury, potential for injury. And that's what happened to me. I didn't train the muscles that were important to keep my hip stable, so other muscles had to take over. You get bad compensation patterns, and then something eventually is going to snap. Now, When you're younger, you can get away with a lot of this stuff, but I've been lifting now for 34 years, and I've been at those elite levels of strength and elite levels of athleticism. And if you don't take care of it at that time, you will have to pay it back. It will be a structural credit card that you have to pay back with interest. And if you're having niggles and compensations, you don't take care of it now, it will catch up to you, and you don't want to end up, you saw how messed up I was a while back, where I couldn't even crawl without pain. I couldn't even stand up straight, and it's taken a good 6 months to get back to almost 100%. Oh, also, last thing, why we had the stick. You wanted me to bring the stick out, because what we also find is that when we have clients like this, a lot of times they have stability issues. So we might have them hold on to a stick so that they can stabilize themselves, and that's okay, especially considering that we're not really, most of the tension we're making is that isometric contraction, so we're not too worried about them pushing the stick too hard and giving them too much support, because all the tension is with the muscle not moving anyway. So as long as they're smashing the calcaneus into the plyo box, as long as they're drawing their hip away, they're getting all the tension that they're looking for, and it doesn't really matter what's happening with the other arm. But if they're falling over while they're trying to do it, then it's not going to be an effective exercise. So we absolutely will brace people if that's what they need.
I think this is useful as well for this position, as well as, like, for example, even if you gave me a cable, just to have that added level of support to focus in on what I'm actually trying to dial in on, rather than trying to go, okay, I need to stay stable, keep my knee bent, and I need to focus on this. There's too many moving parts. It becomes very difficult to actually isolate one muscle group.
Yeah, and it's like you see a lot of coaches, they'll be like, okay, do the movement, and you're wobbling around, they're like, no, stabilize, 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 and they start, pushing you around. It's like, just give them a fucking stick, man. I mean, the whole point is to get the muscle active, get more body awareness, get the nervous system and the brain understanding how to turn the muscles on and off, how to get the muscle synchronicity you need to then for everything to work together. So we think about it, I like to think about it like if you've ever seen an orchestra, right? So you've got the conductor, and you think he's just waving his arms around, but what he's doing is he's managing the tempo, and he's telling certain pieces of the orchestra to play louder or softer or faster or slower. So the brain is like the conductor, and then he's dealing with the woods and the percussion and the brass, and he's got all of these different components. So he's basically telling the motor units who needs to turn on and off in order to do a certain movement correctly in the right order and at the right intensity. So if they're very unstable, sometimes we need to go through a positioning of more stability and isolated movement to get their brain to then understand how to operate the motor units and the muscles in the right motor patterns. And then we can take the stick away, and happy days, they're much more stable, and then eventually we get them moving through three-dimensional space and time.
And I don't know about you, but I definitely find having a trainer yell stabilize at me increases my stress response, which definitely increases my stability.
That's what I love. I love condescending trainer. They're always fun.
Yelling that repeated word.